Okay, so the most interesting thing you'll see with the switch from I1 to I2 is typically on the I1 portion of the curve and all the way out to the right, where on concentric dominated motor abilities, the force that you can produce by the body is always going to be higher in the mass case. Well, it actually inverts when we get into I2 motor abilities, because now we're using eccentric muscle action to help us store more elastic energy, and we can produce more force at higher eccentric velocities. So at this point, the mass-based version of the motor ability is going to be a lower force output than the velocity-based version of the motor ability. That being said, the I2 one is a little bit nuanced, and something that we'll see too is like the total force produced during the mass-based version is going to be higher because the movement velocity is slower, so the total impulse is going to be higher, whereas with the velocity-based version, the movements are going to be very fast, so there's not going to be high amount of total force produced, but the peak magnitude of the force can be extraordinarily high and much higher than anything you can produce during slower exercises. So that being said, we'll move on to the I2 stuff. We'll start with I2 mass. So the main thing with the I2 mass is we're using eccentric muscle contractions to get a stronger isometric action than we can achieve by starting from a concentric action, or even just doing a pure isometric action. We're using that stored elastic energy from all the connective tissue in the muscle itself to produce extraordinarily high forces isometrically. So the I2 mass-based version, in its simplest form, you're just going to load the bar up. Generally, it's going to be heavier than your 1 rep max. And basically, you're just going to lower the weight down, and then you're going to, until you hit the point of the range of motion that you're trying to train. And you're going to hold that for as long as you can. And then once you can no longer hold it, then you're just going to lower the weight down onto the racks. Now, the thing is, as soon as you hit that isometric action with the velocity-based version of it, your force production is going to drop off. But, so what we're trying to do here, and the goal with any of our I2 velocity-based stuff, and there's a fair amount of nuance to this, is that you're never hitting the isometric portion of the action is going to be relatively weak compared to the eccentric portion of it. But you're trying to minimize the eccentric portion of the exercise to become as isometric as possible. So what you're trying to do for that is you're trying to minimize the distance that you're in that eccentric portion of the exercise. And what does that look like? It looks like any kind of exercise where you're hitting moderate to high velocities and you're coming to an abrupt stop. If we're trying to train, our ability to produce a high amount of peak power from the bottom of a squat, we're going to get in that bottom squat position and we're going to jump up and we're going to stomp our feet down really hard. And basically, you're really focused on not having a long eccentric phase. You don't want to be doing this where you're using, the full range of motion to cushion that impact. You're really trying to get to like a decently high velocity, and then you're trying to stop it immediately as soon as you land. And you can do this with kind of any portion of the range of motion. So if you're doing this with like even a barbell squat, you're kind of in this portion of the range of motion, and then you're just you're jumping up and you're stomping your feet down really hard. For the velocity-based version of it, we can always, if we're trying to progress the exercise, if we're shooting for more velocity, in that case, we're trying to reach a higher height when we jump up, and we're trying to smash our feet down. We're basically trying to make our body achieve a higher eccentric velocity before we come to a stop. So what that might look like is instead of being down here on the ground, when you jump up, instead of just barely leaving the ground, you're going to jump up, and then you're going to pull your knees up to your chest, and then you're going to drop your feet back down. Another means of doing it too is you kind of get in that low squat position, and then you're jumping up, and then you're coming down. Then you can increase the height of that over time. That'd be another way you can incorporate more velocity into that movement. Obviously, if you want to make it more mass-like, you just add more mass to the exercise and you don't increase the velocity of the movement. Obviously, like that I2 velocity movement, like the peak forces are really high and it's very jarring on the body, and it's something that if you're going to start implementing, be extremely conservative at first. It's not something you're going to if you start piling a ton of intensity and a ton of volume into that exercise, you're not used to doing it, it's a great way to rupture stuff. So, and as we kind of get into, and you'll see this as we get into these training methods that are higher to the left, and the total and peak force production of these training methods is higher. They're very powerful training means, but you have to be more conservative with them as you do them, because they're much more stressful on the body than those motor abilities that are on the lower right portion of the force velocity curve. Now, same thing. So if we go back to the I2 mass-based version, we can always add more mass to the exercise, simply enough. if you want to add some velocity to the exercise, a way to do it is when we start training those isometric actions, as opposed to slowly lowering down into the isometric action, we can go faster. We can try to drop faster into that isometric action with the heavier weights. And what that's going to do is that's going to help, use that stored elastic energy. We're going to be able to generate more higher peak forces as we transition to that isometric action. So that's a way to play with that's a way to play with that motor ability on that front. So anyways, that's the mass and velocity versions of the I2 motor ability. We'll go into the eccentric motor abilities in the next video. These ones are actually kind of fun too. So see you then.